If you're from the US, you might be saying, what was the Cadillac BLS? I don't remember that. And you'd be right. The BLS has the distinction as being the only Cadillac that was never sold in the US. Well, until very recently, but more of that at the end. This is a story of General Motors' attempt to turn around a brand that had lost its way. The BLS, though, is a good example of all that GM was doing wrong in the mid-2000s, and it was part of its downfall. This is the Cadillac BLS story. The Cadillac name was originally a rebranding exercise. Back in 1901 it was called the Henry Ford Company, something of a surprise given it's now owned by GM, Ford's biggest rival. The Henry Ford Company was, unsurprisingly, founded by Henry Ford, but after a dispute he left the company. Given Ford wanted nothing to do with it, the company had to find a new name. It was rebranded as Cadillac, named after the French explorer that had founded Detroit. A few years later it was sold to General Motors, a company that was growing rapidly. And to continue that expansion they wanted to export around the world. In 1935 GM established Cadillac Europe in Switzerland, where they began manufacturing cars. The Second World War interrupted production and it never got going again. Cadillacs continued to be imported from America. But as the cars that Cadillac made got bigger and bigger, European demand got smaller and smaller. After all, parking spots weren't getting any larger. The 1973 oil crisis killed off a lot more sales of these gas-guzzling cars, limiting Cadillac Europe to just a trickle of imports. At the same time, Cadillac's market share in North America was getting eaten alive by Europe's luxury cars in the form of BMW and Mercedes, with Audi coming up fast. It wasn't just Europeans that didn't find Cadillac's cars interesting. With good margins in luxury cars, this was something GM needed to fix as a top priority. They took a page out of Ford's playbook. Ford decided to combat the German threat with their own German division, branding them with the Merkur brand, the German word for Mercury. GM had their own German company, Opel, that produced cost-effective, reliable cars. They even had luxury models, so GM brought a redesigned Omega to the US as the Cadillac Catera, blinging it up with bits from the GM Opel parts bin. With more, let's say, European handling, i.e. it didn't wallow around like a boat, it was marketed with the tagline, "the Caddy that zigs." It was supposed to start a new driver-focused Cadillac, but with only an automatic gearbox and no cup holders, the Catera didn't draw in younger Americans, just existing customers who wanted to spend a little less. Maybe they shouldn't have been too surprised though. It wasn't like the Omega was a car young buyers wanted to get in Europe. That is, unless it had a little Lotus magic sprinkled all over it. Other than the 1998 Escalade, a tall boat of a car that struck a chord with Americans, Cadillac's next attempt to update their image was with the replacement for the Catera, the CTS. This was a car with good handling, tuned on the Nürburgring, and it came with decent transmission options, a 5-speed manual or the same 5-speed automatic used in the BMW 5 Series. It could get to 60 in around 7 seconds and had the sort of looks that could attract younger buyers into Cadillac showrooms, once they'd used MapQuest to find out where it was, of course. Part of this turnaround plan was to take the fight to Europe, so by 2002 the CTS was being sold there through that Swiss subsidiary, along with the larger Seville that was never going to attract much attention, but at least rounded out the range. It would be joined by the XLR, a Corvette with a luxury makeover, not a bad idea, and the SRX, a car marketed as a mid-size SUV in North America, but a pretty big car for European roads. And that was one of the problems with Cadillac's European strategy. They made very large vehicles, too large for European roads. The CTS was a small luxury car in North America, but it was the same size as a BMW 5 Series. If Cadillac wanted to succeed in Europe, they needed something to take on Europe's biggest luxury sellers, the A4 and the 3 Series. GM had another plan to beat its German rivals, buy up and develop an existing European luxury brand. They tried to buy Jaguar in the 1980s, but Ford swept in and stole it from underneath their nose. GM settled for second prize by buying Saab in 1989, a Swedish automaker that had been steadily moving upmarket and was seen as a somewhat luxury brand in the US. Certainly not as desirable as Jaguar, BMW, Mercedes or Audi, but something a little exotic that had a bit of a cool turbo performance vibe going about it. The relationship between the two companies soon became strained though. Saab wanted to chart their own course with the 1994 update to the 900, a car confusingly renamed the 93 in 1998, but GM wanted them to use the same platform used by the Vectra. Saab ended up using it, but made a lot of changes which annoyed GM. Saab felt it was necessary because the platform they were given didn't allow Saab to make the car that they wanted, and GM didn't want Saab wasting a whole load of money reinventing the wheel. Just use the existing platform, put a new body on it, tweak the suspension and install an up-spec trim. Job done. I'm sure the less than stellar 9.3 sales left both sides pointing fingers at each other, saying the car should have been more or less customised. Reviewers pointed out that it wasn't as luxurious, refined or as sporty as the equivalent BMW or Audi, and it had one of those odd hatchback things on the back that luxury customers had so roundly rejected in the 1980s. The next generation 9.3 arrived in 2002, vastly improved to take on the best Germany could throw at it. Cadillac felt that they could get a quick win by taking the 9.3, reskinning it and slapping on a Cadillac badge as they'd done with the Corvette. That would surely solve Cadillac's entry-level dilemma in Europe and beyond. The rework would be done at Saab's development centre in Sweden. I'd like to think Cadillac showed Saab a photo of the CTS and said, turn the 9.3 into a smaller version of that. Oh, and put the ignition switch next to the steering wheel like normal cars rather than between the seats. Anyway, that's precisely what the team did. Cadillac showed off the concept at the 2005 Geneva Motor Show, pitched as the BLS. Some joked it stood for Bob Lutz Special, this being a reference to Vice Chairman Bob Lutz, who was a big fan of badge engineering, taking one car and modifying it a little to fill in the gap in another brand's lineup. According to GM, the name was much more boring though, standing for B-segment luxury sedan. But surely it really stood for bit like Saab. Logically, the BLS was built in the same Swedish factory as the 9.3, and with the 9.3 underperforming in the market, it would give workers there something to do. Given the lack of journalistic coverage from that time, it's safe to say that the public weren't exactly waiting for the car with bated breath. After all, this was the same year that the STS launched in Europe, a car that Top Gear called rubbish. That was a larger car that was never going to sell in large quantities in Europe, but the CTS had shown Cadillac was changing in a positive way. Maybe the BLS could also deliver something special. The BLS launched in 2006 with a splash. This was a new European Cadillac with bold looks that announced America was coming to Europe and taking no prisoners. The stunning design of the CTS had been shrunk down to become a new BMW 3 Series killer. That bravado was quickly dismantled by reviewers. This was really just a 9.3 with a different look. It used a subset of its engines, a 2-litre, 2.8-litre V6, and shock, horror, a 1.9-litre diesel. What? In a Cadillac? But it had the advantage of probably being the most fuel-efficient Cadillac ever sold up until this point. The inside was a bit like the Las Vegas Sphinx. From a distance, it looks impressive, but up close, it was a little tacky, just roughly crafted concrete. The BLS's interior looked good and was well appointed, with air conditioning and a Bose stereo, but the plastics felt cheap. At least the ignition key had moved up near the steering wheel, making room for that all-important cup holder. It looked like a 9.3 inside, and surprise, surprise, it drove like one as well. Cadillac were at pains to point out that this was set up a little softer than most European luxury saloons because it would be less jarring for the sort of driving most people do, going over bumpy roads around town or cruising on a motorway. They called it performance without the punishment. Unfortunately, reviewers just said the car drove like the humble Signum. That wasn't to say it was bad, but it didn't match up to the competition. Good luck buying a BLS, there was a shocking lack of dealers. Cadillac tried to mitigate that with a free delivery service, but that wasn't going to make it easier for servicing or if there were any problems. Why take a risk on a car that might be a little cheaper than the competition, but wasn't any better? It didn't help it was front-wheel drive without an option of all-wheel drive. That wasn't necessary to win in this sector. The Audi A4 was front-wheel drive, but influential petrol heads talked up the joys of rear-wheel drive on cars like the BMW 3 Series. It's not like Cadillac was a particularly desirable brand in Europe either. It might be different and quirky, but if you were into different and quirky, you could always buy a Saab, maybe a car like the 9.3. There were plenty of dealers around to help you as well. Reviewers across the board gave the Cadillac BLS a 2 or 3 out of 5-star meh score. Cadillac didn't just sell in North America and Europe, and although this car was a little small for the States, it did get exported to other parts of the world, the Middle East, South Africa, South Korea, and it got close to the US being offered in Mexico. Cadillac started assembly in Russia as well, an important and growing market that had fewer preconceived ideas on what a Cadillac brand was all about. A year later, the BLS became an estate, or wagon as it's called, the first Cadillac with this shape. So you'd be forgiven for thinking that the word wagon stuck in Cadillac marketers' throat a little. The thinking was that a larger range would widen the appeal of the Cadillac brand. Estates were popular in Europe, and there was already a Saab 9.3 estate, so most of the work had already been done. To give the car performance and frugality, there was a new 180 horsepower turbo diesel with an 8.7 second 0 to 60 time. To counter the argument that the BLS's ride wasn't on par with the competition, Cadillac offered electronic stability control as standard. This improved the handling, although ironically reviewers dinged it for feeling a little firm, the opposite problem the saloon had. They agreed it gave the car decent handling, but the steering's lack of feedback and precision were a disappointment. European car buyers had grown up seeing Cadillacs on TV, but not as a prestige car, as big wallowing vehicles with no street cred. It takes a long time to turn around people's perceptions. It's not impossible, look at the Skoda brand today, but to do it you need to sell good, solid cars at a discount for a long time. Sales of the BLS were disappointing, but GM had bigger problems. The company was hemorrhaging cash, and the 2008 global financial crisis was the straw that broke the camel's back. GM filed for bankruptcy protection, and in the shake-up, things like the European expansion of the Cadillac brand had to go. In any case, GM were being forced to sell Saab, so BLS production would have to be relocated. After spending over £100 million developing their new compact luxury car, production of the BLS ended in 2009 after selling only 7,356 cars. The BLS was the only Cadillac not sold in the USA. That was until 2023 when the GT4 crossover launched as a China exclusive. The luxury sector is important to every car manufacturer. There's good money to be made, but it also gives prestige to the whole brand. If you buy a Toyota, then like as not it'll use the same parts as a Lexus. The high-end features in luxury models filter down to mainstream models. GM still feels the need to have a luxury brand, which is why it's continued to develop the Cadillac brand. When the BLS launched, GM described it as a critical entry with which to grow our business in key international markets. That's as true today as it was then, but GM is still attempting to return to its former greatness, and that global dream will have to wait. It's not clear why GM expected the BLS to succeed. After all, the Cadillac brand was either unknown or renowned for gas-guzzling boats in Europe. It certainly wasn't seen as a prestige brand, And the BLS was essentially a Saab 9.3, and that car wasn't good enough to best Audi, BMW or Mercedes. GM first needed to make a car that was better than its rivals. Then the smart buyers would seek out the BLS as it was the smart choice. That would have ensured resale values remained high as well. After all, that's the playbook for how BMW conquered North America. Then there was the Cadillac dealer network. There were only 12 dealers in the UK when the BLS launched. Surely it would have made more sense to sell Cadillacs through the Saab dealer network, which at that time were plentiful. There are only a few BLSs left on the road today. It's a memory of a GM that had a little more swagger, but who bit off more than they could chew. I've done a video on the history of Saab that I called the Saab story, and you pointed out it could be called a sob story, which was pretty good. I missed that trick. There's also a history of the Saab 900. Both videos are on the right. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.